Welcome to week 13. This week we are actually going to get started on your final. We're going to take a look at grid and then we're going to get to your final, which is a 4-piece project. So first here I have a type lecture. I want to just again reiterate that you are constantly looking at history and seeing how we've grown. So I'll let you look through this. These are a lot of visual examples, so you can kind of just see, and then there's some notes at the bottom starting with movable type. Again, all of the stuff that we've talked about all throughout the term. Just look at how fonts have developed. Look at what you think of each of these. You know, all the way down, we've got our signs. Real thick to thin ratio here. Just again, fun and important to know where we came from. Then I have a bunch of information on grid, okay? Grid is kind of the next step. Remember, we talked about letters, we talked about words, we talked about sentences, we talked about paragraphs. Well, now when you have those paragraphs of text, how do we organize them? So I have a lot of information here because there is a lot of different ways that you can organize grids, and things are more successful than others, how you organize your layout. So I wanted you to take a look here. A grid is a system of horizontal and vertical lines that can guide layout choices. Grids have been a part of page layout since the Gutenberg Bible. The pages below use a grid of 4 vertical and 2 horizontal lines. Meaning the top and the bottom here, and we've got 4 sections here. Okay. Grids are helpful when they encourage consistency. They make it easier to relate elements on the page to existing ones. Okay, so we're thinking of layout here. They're not helpful if they create a false sense of security. Take a look at some websites and I'll show you some more examples, and look at magazines, look at books, think about things, how they are laid out. Okay, and I'll let you read about this more on your own. Golden section. This is actually, Thinking with Type is a really excellent book, so if you're interested you can kind of look through this whole section. But how we can use golden section with grid. Okay, then this goes into a multi-column grid, designing with a hang line, and just see, as you're learning about these, what do you think? Do you think it's visually appealing or not? And I'm going to come back to this in a second. Quick look at types of grids. Secret to any good design lies in the way its visual elements are organized and positioned in relation to each other. Layout design, right? Parts of the grid. Margins are the empty spaces between the edges of the format and the content. So, the edge of your page, we have a margin. Depending upon what class you're in or what you're trying to do, they might tell you how wide your margin needs to be. Flow lines are the horizontal lines that separate the different sections of grid into parallel bands. Modules, building blocks of any grid, the spaces created between the flow lines and the vertical lines. Spatial zones or regions. Groups of adjacent modules in vertical and horizontal areas create spatial zones or regions. So it's kind of interesting that when we look at all this, there's no text in here, but you can kind of squint and see what your layout would be and how you think it would function. So I would recommend kind of doing that throughout and even when you do your assignment to see what you like. Columns are the vertical spatial zones or regions that fit fully from the top to bottom margin. Rows are the horizontal version. Gutters, spaces between rows and columns. So lots of vocab here. And then we get into the type of grids again. So again, just trying to talk to you about the different types that are common and how we can use them. And it's cool to see it in different ways, right? They're using the same grid, but in different ways. Okay, so I'll let you go through those as well. And then I have this page that is more for newer designers, but I think it's important to look at, and it's important to see kind of what their order is and how we follow it. So defining your goals, so what we always start with, content hierarchy, laying out all of your content, picking your typefaces, etc. So I would just look through this, and then you can kind of see how this develops and how they use grid and how they space things out. And then creating grids for screens. Sometimes we'll be doing print work, sometimes we're doing web, so it's important to think about the differences between the two. They go over the anatomy again, and they talk about how we can kind of do it in a computer program. All right, so speaking of print versus web, there are some font choices that you may have that will work better for print and some will work better for web. You're going to need to think about how is your audience going to be viewing this. Now, when we're dealing with web, we also have our phone, iPads, tablets, and computers, so you need to be aware of these different ways that your font is going to be viewed. So this is just kind of optimized fonts for the web, explaining the difference between print and web, and what works for each. Typography is a powerful tool in marketing and design, helps get your message across. Okay, it's often said good typography can't be seen, meaning if the viewer is paying more attention to the font you used or if the font is unreadable, it's not doing its job. I think that is a very, very important thing for us to think about. So we need to pay attention to what will make it do its job. Everything that we've been talking about throughout the term. So this is just a nice kind of sum up for that. And then 15 visual differences. So again, it's thinking about your target audience. How is a viewer going to see it? Are they going to be able to touch it? Are they going to see it in the light, in the dark? What color is it going to be? What font choices are you going to use? So again, looking through all of those. Now, we looked at logo design, but I wanted to further discuss typography and branding. Fonts and typography is usually a topic that has been reserved for the graphic designers and people that are particularly interested, mostly ignored for the rest. Fortunately, this is starting to change. The use of type and fonts are more important when it comes to branding than one might think. So, when we're thinking of branding, we're thinking of a company and all of their design materials that go together. Your font choices are really going to make all of these pieces cohesive. You need to talk about what your brand is through the typography that you use. And I know we've done a lot of that throughout the term, but I just want to reiterate it here and talk about, why it is important in branding. Beauty and legibility, how words look, order, brand recognition. Now, if you get into branding or if you're working in that type of a career, recognition is vital. You want to be able to see a word in the font that you chose and know exactly what company that is. This is creating a brand identity, just 20 questions to ask before you get started, and style guides from around the world. You need to think about what you are designing for and where, right? Your audience, depending on their location, may see things differently. And I also thought this was just kind of cool to see style guides as well. So there's a bunch of companies here. You can click, let's do Dropbox. So you can see their logo, our grid, the placement, everything. So take a look at some of these to get inspired. Next, we have your assignment due Wednesday. Using lorem ipsum, which is just the Latin, create 2 pages that would be in the book that you created the cover for. Okay, I want you to sketch 5 different ideas. Think about a very, very creative, different layout, then a very basic one, and kind of think about everything in between. Use your knowledge on grid to think of successful layouts. Pick a font that you think is easy to read and that would actually be used in a book. So you'll have 5 sketches. The sketches you can just use like kind of swiggle lines to show the text, but in your PDF I want you to use lorem ipsum. Each page should be around 6 inches across and 8 inches tall. You can do it as one 12 by 8 inch document, or you can have 2 6 by 8, completely up to you. And if we go back to thinking with type here, you can look at the different types of grids and you can use guidelines to create this, right? We would just pull out guidelines to different dimensions and you can start to get your layout that way. I recommend using grids all the time to make sure that you're working, your different text blocks are in alignment, but that's a great way to kind of create a grid and then drag and drop what you want to put in each section. It is important to know that once you have a grid created like this, notice we have text that goes over it and is actually filling up more of the spaces. I'm just going to use this preset as a default. So remember Command R to show your rulers, and then you'll click and drag out from a ruler. And we can create whatever type of grid you would like. Okay? Just be aware of what you're creating. Use the rulers. You'll be working in inches so you can actually see it a little bit better. But then you can play around with your text in which boxes you want it to be in. All right, that is due Wednesday. Then we're getting into your final. For this final, you're going to create a package for a resort or vacation spot. Think about the tools that we've discussed all term long. Typography is going to be the main focus, but you'll be thinking about imagery, color, layout, and you need to draw in your audience. Your final package will include a branding sheet, creative brief, whatever you want to call it, which is a written description of the location, your target audience, the mission, the logo, the colors, and the fonts that you want to use. Kind of like those examples that we looked at before, and I have some other things that I can show you too. You will then need a print ad for the resort or location, a web ad, a magazine cover, so you would be the feature story of the magazine. So you want the magazine cover featuring your location, and then a 2-page layout describing the location. Will be a double-page spread, thinking about layout and grid. All right, so this week we're doing the creative brief and the sketches with your branding sheet. When writing your creative brief, you want to answer any questions that could come up for the project. This is finalizing all of the details before you get started. You want to figure out your color scheme, your font choices, your target audience, your timeline, and define your goals for the project. You can research creative briefs, but it's getting all of your information down on paper. You can do a mood board if you would like as well. So, the creative brief. Think of a creative brief as a sort of map that will lead the team's creative thinking from problems to solution. Now, you're your own creative team, but this is a way to define everything, okay? What is to be created? I told you. You need to create the creative brief and the 4 pieces. What's the purpose? To market your location, resort, whatever it is. I've had people do outer space. I've had people do Florida. I've had people do everything you can think of. So feel free to be creative and get excited with what your location will be. So you'll want to answer all of these kind of questions. And I'll let you go through it. But a lot of times this is something that if you were working with a client, you would create. It gets everyone kind of on the same page and make sure everything is thought out and will work well before you actually take the time to create the pieces. You're going to want to create a timeline for yourself. Now, we have the creative brief due Sunday. Then the following weeks, you're going to develop your ideas in Illustrator. I would think about all 4 of them, but focus in on 2. The following week, we'll finalize and get all files working together and separately. And then Monday of week 16, your finals are due. Okay, so that's a base timeline, but I would kind of try to give yourself a more distinct and detailed timeline that you can try to follow. Okay, you do have several weeks to work on this, so I expect to see a project that shows that you've worked on it for several weeks. Try to build your portfolio with some of these, if not all of them. Okay, so a lot of information to read this week. Look through all of it. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to seeing your creative briefs.